He fired one shot into the sky and asked God for something, anything, to make the silence stop. 2 days later, a woman collapsed on his doorstep with blood on her dress, a letter in her fist, and a secret that would tear 3 brothers apart before it ever brought them together. If you've ever waited for something you stopped believing in, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single moment, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The shot woke Caleb first. He bolted upright in his bunk heart, slamming hand already reaching for the rifle hanging above his head before his eyes were even open. By the time his bare feet hit the floorboards, he knew it hadn't been a threat. The sound had come from the ridge, single clean, aimed at nothing. And there was only one man on this ranch who fired at nothing. Caleb set the rifle down and pressed his palms flat against the wooden wall. He breathed slow. Let the silence settle back over the valley, like it always did after Silas did something the rest of them weren't supposed to understand. Down the hall, Jonah hadn't moved at all, which meant Jonah had been awake already, lying flat, and still in the dark, the way he always did, cataloging every sound the mountain made between midnight and dawn. Jonah heard everything. He just never said so. Caleb walked to the window and looked out at the ridge. The silhouette of his oldest brother stood against a sky that was just beginning to bleed the first pale gray of morning. Silas had his back to the ranch, rifle pointed up at an angle, arm coming back down slow. Whatever he'd been firing at, it wasn't an animal. Caleb had seen Silas shoot wolves, coyotes, rattlesnakes, rustlers, and one particularly determined revenue man who'd wandered onto the property 3 summers back without announcing himself. Every one of those shots had a purpose, a direction, a reason you could point to. This one hadn't, and that scared Caleb worse than any of the others. Silas Walker was 29 years old and had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 11 months. He knew the exact number because he'd started keeping count after the first winter, without their father when the dreams began, and the silence of the main house stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like something that was slowly eating him from the inside out. He'd tried whiskey for a while, then hard work, then longer hours, then silence so complete that Caleb had stopped talking to him at dinner because there didn't seem to be any point. Nothing touched it. The emptiness just sat there underneath everything, patient and permanent, like a stone at the bottom of a river that the current never quite moved. He hadn't meant to fire the shot. He'd walked out before sunrise because sleep had abandoned him again, and the walls of the main house had started closing in around 3 in the morning. He'd taken the rifle out of habit, crossed the yard, climbed the ridge the way he did most mornings, and stood there watching the valley below fill up with pale gold light. And then, without deciding to, without thinking, without any clear reason he could have named if someone had asked him, he raised the rifle and pulled the trigger. The echo rolled out across the valley and came back to him, changed softer, like something the mountain had absorbed, and returned gently. And Silas, who had not spoken to God since the night his mother was buried, pressed his lips together and said 3 words into the empty air. "Send me something." He didn't say what. He didn't say who. He didn't ask for anything he could name because he didn't have the language for it anymore. He just stood on the ridge in the early morning heat with an empty rifle and a chest full of something he hadn't yet found a word for, and asked a sky that might or might not be listening to send him anything at all that would make this feel like a life worth living. Then he turned around and walked back down to start the day. The freight wagon appeared on the south road 2 days later. Caleb saw it first because Caleb was always the one who saw things coming. It was his particular gift, and his particular curse. He felt the world moving before it arrived, which meant he also felt every bad thing before it reached the door. He called out from the fence post where he was working. "Silas," just the one word, but the way he said it made Jonah put down the water bucket he was carrying and turn around. Made Silas, who was mending the east gate hinge 40 yards away, go still without looking up. The wagon was moving wrong. It was weaving. Not the way a drunk driver weaves all lazy and boneless. The way something weaves when the person holding the reins has stopped being fully conscious. The horse was making its own decisions, And the horse's decision was to follow the road south toward the only water source within 12 miles. Silas dropped the gate hinge. He was moving before the thought fully formed. Long strides covering ground the way only a man raised on big land moves, efficient, unhurried looking, but fast, the kind of walk that gets somewhere before you realize it's going there. He reached the wagon as it slowed to a stop near the fence line. The horse was laboring, coated in dried sweat ribs showing their outline through the hide head hanging low. It had been running or walking hard in serious heat for a long time. Silas ran a hand along the animal's neck out of pure reflex, feeling the heat radiating off the skin. And then he looked into the wagon bed. She was curled against the side of it, not lying flat the way someone lies when they choose to rest. Curled the way a person ends up when their body simply stops and folds itself wherever it happens to be. Her dress was dark with sweat along the spine and the collar. Her hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had started in and was matted against the side of her face. One hand was pressed flat to the wagon floor. The other was clenched around something he couldn't see. She was breathing. He could see that from where he stood. Shallow and fast, the kind of breathing a body does when it's working too hard just to keep going. But breathing. "Jonah," Silas said without raising his voice. Jonah was already there. They got her into the house. Silas carried her because Silas was the one who'd reached her first, and because nobody argued about things like that when Silas had already decided. She weighed less than he expected, and he hated what it implied about how long she'd been without enough food or water. Caleb pulled back the bed covers in the small room off the kitchen. Jonah pumped water. Nobody spoke because there wasn't anything to say yet, and the Walker brothers had long ago figured out that words were most useful after you understood the situation, not before. Silas laid her down on the bed. She stirred when he set her down. Not waking, just shifting some part of her reacting to the change in movement. Her head turned to the side. Her lips moved. "Don't," she said, or something that sounded like it. Her voice was barely a thread. Silas stepped back. "Nobody's going to do anything to you." She didn't respond, already gone again. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he turned around and found Caleb holding out a folded letter. "Was in her hand," Caleb said. "She wouldn't let go of it. I had to work my fingers under hers." The letter was addressed in a hand Silas didn't recognize. To Mr. Caleb Walker, Bitter Ridge Valley, Montana Territory. Silas looked at his younger brother. Caleb had the particular expression of a man who is about to explain something and knows the explanation is not going to land well. "You want to read it now, or?" Silas took the letter. He read it in the kitchen, standing at the table, while Jonah stayed in the doorway of the small room in case the woman's condition changed. It was 3 pages written in a careful, educated hand. A woman's hand, he thought, though he couldn't have said exactly why he was sure of that. The first page introduced herself. Clara Bennett of Boston, Massachusetts, 22 years of age, daughter of a merchant family that had, as she put it, with a directness that surprised him, spent everything they had keeping up appearances that no longer had anything behind them. She had been educated. She could read, write, keep accounts, manage a household, and had spent 2 years working as a schoolteacher before family circumstances had made that impossible. She did not explain what family circumstances. She simply stated that they had made continuing in Boston untenable. The second page explained how she had come to write to Caleb Walker of Bitter Ridge Valley, Montana. She had answered an advertisement, a mail-order bride advertisement placed in a Boston paper signed with the name C. Walker. Silas stopped reading. He set the page down flat on the table. He breathed once deliberately. Then he picked it up again. The advertisement Clara wrote had described a man of 26 years, owner of a working cattle ranch in Montana Territory, seeking a capable and serious-minded woman willing to make a life in the West. The man had described himself as someone who valued hard work over pretension and honesty over charm. He had said in the advertisement that he was not looking for a woman to decorate his house. He was looking for a partner. Clara had read it 4 times before responding. She had written back, she said, because it was the first advertisement she had read that did not describe what the man wanted to receive. It described what he was willing to offer. The 3rd page was shorter. She was coming. She had already bought the ticket and arranged the freight. She understood there was risk. She understood the distance. She understood that she was making a decision that could not be undone. She was making it anyway because staying where she was had already become its own kind of undoing. She ended with one line. "I hope I am not a disappointment, Mr. Walker. I have been one before. I am trying very hard not to be again." Silas set the letter down. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he said without turning around, "Caleb." His brother appeared in the kitchen doorway immediately, which meant Caleb had been standing right there, which meant Caleb had been waiting. "When?" Silas said. Not a question. Caleb knew what it meant anyway. 6 weeks ago, maybe 7. Under my name. Under C. Walker, Caleb said, and his voice had gone careful. "I didn't write your name." "You wrote this family's name." Caleb was quiet. "You went into a newspaper," Silas said, still not turning around, his voice entirely level, in the way that was worse than shouting, "and you told a woman in Boston that she had somewhere to go, that there was a man here waiting for her, and you did not tell me. You wouldn't have agreed." "No," Silas said. "I wouldn't have." "That's why I didn't tell you." The silence stretched between them long enough to have texture. "She's sick," Silas finally said. "How sick we don't know yet. She traveled I don't know how far in summer heat without enough water. She's in our guest room. And she came here believing she had a future." He turned around then, and Caleb took half a step back, without meaning to, not from fear exactly, but from the expression on his oldest brother's face. "You are going to help me make sure she doesn't die. And then we are going to figure out what to do. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Good." Silas moved past him toward the door. "Get Jonah. We need more water and the fever kit from the barn." She didn't wake up that first day. The fever ran high enough that Silas sent Jonah for the doctor in town, even though the ride was 4 hours each way, and they didn't know if the doctor would be sober enough to be useful when Jonah found him. Jonah went without being asked twice, saddled up, and was gone before the sun reached midday. Silas and Caleb worked in shifts. Cool water, fresh cloths. Careful hands keeping the temperature from climbing higher. Silas had done this before years ago for his father during the bad winter of '68 when the influenza had moved through the valley. He knew the rhythm of it. You didn't fight the fever, you managed it. You kept the body from burning through its own resources before it had a chance to turn the corner. What he didn't know how to manage was the feeling that sat in his chest every time he changed the cloth on her forehead and she turned into his hand without waking. Like she trusted him. Like whatever her body knew about danger had decided in some place below consciousness that this particular pair of hands was safe. Silas had not been trusted in a long time. Not like that. Not the way a person trusts you when they're not awake enough to decide whether to. He told himself it meant nothing. Told himself it was just the fever and the exhaustion of a sick woman reaching for any solid thing. Told himself it was not about him at all. He kept changing the cloth. She said 3 things while she was unconscious. The first was a name Edward spoken with a flatness that carried more emotion than most shouts. She said it twice in quick succession like she was answering something, and both times her jaw tightened and her hands curled at her sides. The second was, "I'm not going back." Clear as anything. Eyes still shut, voice barely above a whisper, but clear. The third was harder to make out. Silas had leaned closer without meaning to, and he caught most of it. "I'm not what they said I was." He sat back. Caleb was watching him from the doorway. "Who's Edward?" Caleb asked. "I don't know," Silas said. "You think she's in trouble?" Silas looked at the woman in the bed. The shadows under her eyes. The thinness of her wrists. The white-knuckle grip she'd had on that letter across however many miles of open summer road. "I think," he said, "she's been in trouble for a while." The doctor arrived the following morning, having ridden through the night after Jonah found him still sober at 7 in the evening and apparently persuaded him that the urgency was genuine. His name was Aldridge. He was 63 thin and had the careful movements of a man who had learned to be precise because steadiness had once been harder won. He examined the woman without speaking, asked Silas 3 questions in quick succession, nodded at the answers, and stood up straight. "Heat exhaustion compounded by dehydration," he said. "And before that, I'd wager not enough food for too long. She's young, and she's strong, or she wouldn't have made it this far. The fever should break within a day. Keep doing exactly what you've been doing." "Will she?" Caleb started. "She'll recover," Aldridge said with the particular authority of someone who has seen enough cases to know the difference between worry and legitimate alarm. "She's past the worst of it. What she needs now is rest, water, and food when she can take it." He looked at Silas. "You her husband?" "No," Silas said. "Relation." A pause. "Not exactly." Aldridge looked between the 3 brothers at the careful way they were all arranged around this woman's sick room, like they'd been there a while and intended to stay longer. He had been a frontier doctor for 30 years, and he had learned not to ask questions that would only produce complicated answers. "Well," he said, "whoever you are, you probably saved her life." He picked up his bag. "Send for me if the fever comes back. Otherwise, let her sleep." She opened her eyes on the morning of the 3rd day. Silas was in the chair beside the bed. He had not meant to be there. He'd come in to check the cloth on her forehead and sat down for what he intended to be 5 minutes, and then apparently his body had decided he was finished for the night, because he woke up in the chair with his neck at an uncomfortable angle and pale early light coming through the window. And the woman in the bed was watching him. Her eyes were gray. He noticed that first before anything else. Not blue-gray or green-gray, but a clear, direct gray, like overcast sky with the sun somewhere behind it. They were open and focused and very much awake, which meant she'd been awake long enough to collect herself before deciding to let him know. That told him something. "You're alive," he said. It came out less gracefully than he intended. "I noticed," she said. Her voice was rough with disuse but steady. "Where am I?" "Bitter Ridge Ranch, South Valley, Montana Territory." Something moved behind her eyes. Not relief, not fear. Recognition. Like a number adding up to a total she'd already suspected. "The Walker Ranch." "Yes." A pause. "Which Walker?" Silas considered the question. "The oldest one." She absorbed that. "There's a letter," she said. "I had a letter." "You did. I have it." "You read it?" "I did." She looked at him for a long moment. He had the sense that she was running calculations he wasn't entirely visible to, sizing up not just him, but the situation, the angles, the variables, the ways this could go. "How long have I been here?" she asked. 3 days. Her eyes closed briefly. When they opened, something in them had shifted, not weaker, but more careful. "And the man named in the advertisement," she said. "Caleb Walker." "My brother." "I see." Another pause. "And the advertisement, the one that brought me here." "I know about it," Silas said. "Did you place it?" He met her gaze. "No." "But you knew about it." "No," he said again. "I read the letter the same time you arrived." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her working through it, the letter, the name, the misdirection, the 3-day gap between what she'd expected and what she'd woken up to. "So I came across half the country," she said slowly, "on the basis of a letter written without the main party's knowledge to marry a man who never agreed to marry anyone." She wasn't asking. She was stating it flat and clear, the way you state a thing when you need to hear it out loud to believe it. "That's about right," Silas said. Clara Bennett closed her eyes again. "That," she said, "is just about perfect." It was not a happy statement. But there was something in the dry flatness of it. Something that was almost, if you listened carefully, the shadow of a woman who still had her sense of humor, even at the bottom of the worst week of her life. Silas felt something shift very slightly, somewhere in the region of his chest. He told himself it was just relief that she was going to be all right. Chaw. Caleb came in around noon. He stood in the doorway of the room with his hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles the way he always did when he was bracing himself for something. Clara was sitting up against the headboard by then, holding a cup of broth that Silas had made, which she was working through slowly and deliberately, as though food were a task she was taking seriously. She looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the floor, then back up at her. "Ma'am," he said. "I'm Caleb Walker." "I know," she said. He nodded. The hat kept turning. "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me quite a lot more than that," she said pleasantly, in the tone of a woman who was choosing not to be unkind, but wanted to be entirely clear. Caleb's mouth tightened at the corner. "Yes, ma'am. But I'll start with the explanation," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He explained. All of it. The advertisement, the thinking behind it, the conviction he'd had that Silas needed something he wouldn't choose for himself, the deliberate choice to sign it, C. Walker, rather than his full name. He talked for 7 or 8 minutes without stopping, and Clara listened without interrupting once, which Silas, watching from the doorway, thought required more discipline than most people had. When Caleb finished, the room was quiet. "Were you trying to help him?" Clara asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you think you did?" Caleb glanced at Silas. "I don't know yet." Clara considered that. "At least you're honest," she said finally. She took another careful sip of the broth. "I'm not going to pretend this is the situation I expected to arrive to. But I am also not going to pretend that the situation I left was better than this." "What situation was that?" Caleb asked. She looked at him, then at Silas, then at the window. "An arranged marriage," she said, "to a man named Edward Harrington, who owns about 1/3 of the shipping interests on the eastern seaboard and is used to getting what he decides he wants." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Silas watched the ripples. "He didn't want to marry you," he said, not meanly, just a question. "He wanted to own me," Clara said with a precision that made the distinction absolutely clear. "There's a difference. He'd made an arrangement with my father when I was 19. I found out about it when I was 21. I left when I was 22. She set the empty cup down on the bedside table, neat and deliberate. "That's the full version. The short version is, I needed to be somewhere he couldn't reach me, and your brother's advertisement was the first door I found that opened in the right direction." Silence. "Does he know where you went?" Silas said. "Not yet," she said. And for the first time since she'd woken up, something moved across her face that was less composure and more exhaustion. The real kind, the bone-deep kind that doesn't come from travel. "But he'll look. Edward always looks. He doesn't like to lose things he's decided are his." Silas straightened in the doorway. Caleb looked at his older brother. Silas was doing the thing he did when he was thinking fast and not showing it. Absolutely still, jaw set, eyes moving just slightly, recalibrating. "You need to eat more than broth," Silas said finally. "Jonah's cooking this evening. He makes a stew that's better than it looks, which I recognize is a low bar given that it looks terrible." Clara blinked. Then something that was nearly a smile crossed her face, brief, careful testing itself out. "That's a very practical response to what I just told you." "We can deal with Harrington when he gets here," Silas said. "Right now you've been sick for 3 days, and you're still thin as a fence rail, and there's nothing useful any of us can do about anything else until you've had a proper meal." He pushed off the doorframe. "So that's what we're doing next." He walked away down the hall. Clara watched the empty doorway for a moment. "Is he always like that?" she asked Caleb. "Yes," Caleb said. "Does he always make it sound reasonable?" Caleb thought about it. "Usually, yeah." Clara looked down at her hands, at the calluses that weren't there yet, at the softness that would have to harden if she was going to survive what she'd stepped into. She thought about Edward Harrington in his Boston office deciding things. She thought about the look on Silas Walker's face when he'd said, We can deal with Harrington when he gets here. Not if, not maybe. Not perhaps you're worried over nothing. When? Like it was a problem with a solution. Like it was something that came after dinner. She pressed her palms flat on the quilt, pushed herself carefully upright, and swung her legs over the side of the bed. She was not going to eat dinner lying down. If she was going to be here, and she had decided that already with the same quiet certainty that had put her on the freight wagon in the first place. Then she was going to start the way she intended to go on her feet. She came to the table that first evening like she was proving something. Silas noticed it immediately, the way she moved through the kitchen with careful, deliberate steadiness. One hand trailing along the wall, not for support, but as a precaution, the way a person who has been knocked down enough times moves through uncertain terrain. She wasn't leaning on anything. She was just making sure she didn't have to. Jonah had set 4 places at the table without being asked. That was the thing about Jonah. He never asked. He just watched, processed, and adjusted. He had set Clara's place at the end closest to the door, which Silas understood and appreciated, not because it was a way out, but because it was the seat that gave her the most room, the most angle, the most sense of not being surrounded. Jonah had been reading people his whole life. He just never told them what he'd read. Clara sat down. She looked at the stew Jonah placed in front of her, and did not comment on what it looked like, which Silas respected more than he expected to. "Thank you," she said, to Jonah directly. Jonah gave one brief nod, sat down. The 4 of them ate. It should have been awkward. By any reasonable measure, it should have been one of the most uncomfortable meals any of them had ever sat through. A woman who'd been unconscious in their guest room 48 hours ago. A brother who had arranged her arrival by deception. A man who hadn't agreed to any of it. And Jonah, who communicated roughly 30 words a day on a talkative afternoon. But it wasn't. It was quiet in the way that a thing is quiet when everyone in the room has decided, without discussing it, to just let it be what it is. Clara ate steadily. Not fast, not slow. Like eating was a job, and she intended to do it properly. Halfway through the bowl, she looked up and caught Silas watching her. She didn't look away. "You want to ask me something," she said. "Several things," he said. "Then ask." "The teaching," he said. "You said you were a school teacher." "2 years," she said, "before my father needed me available for other purposes." The way she said "other purposes" had the particular flatness of a woman who had already finished being bitter about something and arrived on the other side of it. "There are children in this valley," Silas said. "Homestead families mostly. The nearest school is 9 miles from some of them. Some of the older kids have stopped going entirely." Clara set her spoon down, looked at him. "You're not asking me to stay," she said. "You're asking me whether I'd be useful if I did." Caleb made a sound that was almost a laugh and turned it into a cough. "That's one way to put it," Silas said. "It's the accurate way." But something in her expression had changed. Not softened exactly. More like interested. The way a person looks when someone has accidentally said something that lands in the right place. 9 miles is too far for small children. "Yes," he said. "There'd need to be a space, materials. We have a bunkhouse room that isn't being used." She was quiet for a moment. Her fingers moved against the table edge, a small unconscious motion, like she was already thinking in practical terms. "I'm not agreeing to anything tonight," she said. "I've been conscious for less than 12 hours. I'm still deciding whether I can stand any of you." "Fair enough," Silas said. Jonah, without looking up from his bowl, said, "She can stand us." Everyone looked at him. He continued eating. It was Caleb said later, the most words Jonah had strung together at a dinner table in 2 years. She asked to see the ranch the next morning, not to be shown it, to see it. The distinction was hers stated plainly when Caleb offered to walk her around, and she said, "I'd rather look at it myself first if you don't mind," in a tone that made it clear minding wasn't genuinely offered as an option. Silas watched her from the gate as she walked the fence line. She moved differently in the daylight outside the confines of the sick room and the kitchen table. Longer strides, head up. She stopped at the cattle pen and spent a solid 5 minutes just watching the animals, and Silas had the distinct impression that she was not looking at them the way a woman from Boston looks at cattle. She was looking at them the way someone looks at a situation they're trying to understand from first principles. She walked the full perimeter of the outbuildings, looked at the roof of the main barn without touching it, then glanced back at him across the yard with an expression that clearly said, "That needs work." He knew. He hadn't gotten to it yet. She came back to where he was standing at the gate and stopped a few feet away, turning to look back at what she'd just walked. "How many heads?" she asked. 240 as of spring count, he said. "More by fall if the season holds. You run it with 3 people. 3 and 2 seasonal hands we bring on for roundup." She nodded slowly. "You're understaffed." "Yes," he said. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "The barn roof, I know, is going to be a problem before winter." "I know that too." She turned and looked at him fully. There was something in the directness of it that he still wasn't entirely accustomed to, not the boldness exactly, but the lack of performance around it. She wasn't being deliberately challenging. She was just looking at him the way you look at something you're trying to understand. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She thought about it for a moment. The advertisement Caleb wrote described a man who valued honesty over charm. "I expected someone blunt, maybe rough, probably a little difficult." "And you're all of those things," she said. "But you also made me broth when I was sick, and you haven't once told me what I ought to do with myself, which is more than most men manage." She paused. "I'm still deciding what to make of you." "You've said that twice now," he said. "Because it's still true." He almost smiled. He felt it try to happen and then stop itself, the way things that have been still for a long time move carefully when they first try to move again. "Take your time," he said. She looked at him a beat longer than necessary. Then she turned back toward the house. "I'm going to need paper," she said over her shoulder. "And something to write with. If I'm going to put together a plan for those children, I need to start thinking about what I have to work with." He watched her walk back across the yard. He told himself again that the thing happening in his chest was just relief. Gratitude, maybe. The practical satisfaction of a problem moving toward a solution. He was not a man who lied to himself. He tried not to be anyway. But some truths arrived slowly. And he had learned a long time ago not to grab at things before they were ready. The first week settled into a rhythm that none of them had planned for, and all of them seemed to need. Clara took the writing materials and produced within 2 days a document she laid on the kitchen table one morning without announcement, a list of names, ages, locations, and estimated travel times. She had gotten the information from Caleb, who knew most of the Valley families. She had organized it without being asked. She had identified which children were closest together, which routes would allow multiple families to share a single morning ride to the bunkhouse room, and which families likely had the resources to contribute materials versus which ones would need the materials provided. Silas picked up the paper, read it, set it back down. "When do you want to start?" he said. 2 weeks, she said. "I need the room cleared and I need word sent to the families. Jonah can ride the valley." "I know," she said. "I already asked him." Silas looked at Jonah, who was standing at the stove. Jonah shrugged one shoulder. "She asked politely," he said. Silas turned back to Clara. She was looking at him with that expression again, the one that wasn't quite a challenge and wasn't quite amusement, but existed somewhere between them in a space that was entirely her own. "You don't wait for permission," he said. "I've spent 22 years waiting for permission," she said. "I've decided I'm done with that." He should have had something to say to that. He didn't. He just nodded. 2 weeks, he said, and went back to his work. The first crack appeared on a Thursday. It was minor, the way first cracks always are small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention, large enough to matter if you were. Caleb and Clara were working together in the bunkhouse room, moving furniture, and Silas could hear them through the open window while he was working on the barn roof. They were talking easily the way two people talk when they've discovered they share a particular frequency, fast overlapping, finishing each other's context, if not each other's sentences. At some point, Caleb said something that made Clara laugh. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh, a real one, sudden and unguarded, the kind that happens before you can decide whether to let it. Silas drove the nail he was holding into the board, then another, then a third. He told himself he wasn't listening. He was absolutely listening. He didn't like what it made him feel because what it made him feel was nothing he had any right to. She hadn't come here for him. She'd come here because his brother had written a letter in his family's name. She was here because she had nowhere else safe to go, not because she had chosen this particular ranch or this particular man. And Caleb had written the advertisement with the best intentions in the world, and Clara was smart and capable and already proving herself useful in ways that the ranch genuinely needed, and none of that had anything to do with whatever complicated pressure was sitting in Silas Walker's chest every time she looked at him with those clear gray eyes and said exactly what she meant. He went back to the nails. 2 days later, Caleb found him at the water trough before breakfast and said with the careful tone of a man choosing his words very deliberately, "I want to be clear about something." Silas kept working. "She came here because of the letter," Caleb said, "which I wrote, and I wrote it with you in mind, not me. I want that on the record." Silas stopped, looked at his brother. Caleb met his gaze steadily, which for Caleb, who tended to look away from difficult things, was its own kind of statement. "I'm not competing," he said. "I just want you to know that." A long pause. "There's nothing to compete over," Silas said. Caleb looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Okay," in the particular tone of someone who does not agree but has decided not to say so. He walked back to the house. Silas stood at the water trough for another minute. Then he picked up his work and got on with the day. The school opened on a Tuesday. 7 children arrived the first morning, 3 from the Alderman homestead. 2 Henderson children and a pair of siblings named Greer, whose mother rode with them and then sat outside the bunkhouse room on an upturned crate for the entire morning, apparently unable to bring herself to leave. Clara did not ask her to leave. Silas watched the first morning from the main barn, doing work that didn't strictly require him to be in the barn, in a spot that happened to have a clear sightline to the bunkhouse. He watched Clara speak to each child individually when they arrived. Crouch down to be at eye level with the youngest. Shake the oldest one's hand like he was an adult. Not because she was performing warmth, he could tell the difference by now, but because she had decided that children deserved to be treated like their presence mattered, and she was acting accordingly. The Greer girl, who couldn't have been more than 6, arrived clinging to her brother's arm and looking like she might cry. Clara noticed. She didn't make a fuss about it. She simply produced something from her coat pocket, a small, smooth river stone, pale with a dark stripe, and placed it in the girl's free hand without comment. "For keeping," she said quietly. "Something to hold when things feel big." The girl looked at the stone. Then she let go of her brother's arm. Silas turned away from the doorway. He walked to the far side of the barn and stood there for a moment with his hands hanging loose at his sides, looking at nothing in particular. He was in serious trouble. He knew it the way you know things you've been trying not to know, not like a revelation, but like an admission. Like finally saying out loud something you've been arguing against in the silence of your own head for long enough that the argument has exhausted itself. He was not going to do anything about it. She was here because of circumstances. She was building something careful and fragile and necessary, and she was doing it on ground that was already uncertain, and the last thing she needed was the man whose house she lived in complicating what she was trying to make simple. She had said it herself, she was not ready to enter another situation where someone expected something from her. He was not going to be that. But he also wasn't going to be able to pretend he didn't feel it. He just had to be better than what he felt. He'd done harder things. The letter arrived on a Friday 3 weeks after Clara had first been carried through the front door. It came with the supply wagon from town, folded sealed, addressed in a hand that was precise. The way expensive education makes handwriting precise, every letter formed with the kind of careful control that takes practice and intention. The letter was addressed to Miss Clara Bennett. There was no return address. There didn't need to be. Silas saw it before she did, because he was the one who took the supply delivery. He stood in the yard holding it for a long moment. He was not the kind of man who read other people's correspondence. He had read her first letter only because it was addressed to his household, and arrived with an unconscious woman, which were extenuating circumstances. This was different. He carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table. When Clara came in from the bunkhouse at midday, she saw it immediately. She went still in the doorway. Just for a second, that brief pause of a person registering something that confirms what they already feared. Then she crossed the room and picked it up. She read it standing at the table. Her back was to Silas, so he could not see her expression, but he could see the change in her posture. The way her shoulders dropped slightly and then straightened, the conscious correction of someone who is reacting and then deciding not to let the reaction show. She set the letter down, turned around. Her face was composed. Entirely carefully composed, the way a face is composed when the person wearing it has had a great deal of practice at not showing what they're actually feeling. "He knows I'm in Montana," she said. "He doesn't know exactly where yet." Silas looked at her. "Yet," he said. "He'll find out," she said. "Edward is thorough. He has resources, and he is not a man who accepts outcomes he didn't choose." She paused. "I thought I'd have more time." "How long?" She thought about it. "Weeks, maybe. A month if we're lucky. He'll hire someone to ask questions in the right places, and eventually, those questions will lead here." The kitchen was very quiet. Silas pulled out a chair and sat down. He folded his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "Then we've got a month," he said. She stared at him. "That's what you're taking from this. What else is there to take?" He held her gaze. "You're here. He's not. That's a month's worth of advantage, and I intend to use it." "Use it for what?" she said. And for the first time since he'd known her, he heard something in her voice that wasn't composure, something underneath the composure, something smaller and more fragile that had been there the whole time and was only showing itself now because it had run out of room to hide. "To do what exactly? He has lawyers and money and legal arrangements that my father signed. I don't have any of that." "No," Silas said. "But you're not in Boston anymore." She looked at him. He looked back. "He can come here," Silas said quietly. "He can come here with his lawyers and his money and his arrangements, and when he does, he's going to find out that this is not Boston." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We need to write to the circuit judge in Helena. We need to find out exactly what a signed arrangement between your father and another man is legally worth in this territory. And we need to have that information before Edward Harrington arrives. Do you understand?" Clara was very still. Something was happening behind her eyes. That process, she ran the rapid, invisible assessment of situations and angles and variables. He had come to recognize it. He waited while she ran it. "You'd do that?" she said finally. Not a question. More like she was testing whether the sentence was real. "Already planning on it," he said. She pressed her lips together. He saw it, that brief, controlled expression of someone who is not going to cry and is very serious about that decision. "Why?" she said. The word came out quieter than she probably intended. Silas looked at her for a long moment. "Because you came a long way," he said, "and you haven't complained once. And those kids needed someone, and you walked in and became that someone before anyone even asked you to." He paused. "And because whatever your father signed, and whatever Harrington decided, you're a person, not a contract. And this is my land, and on my land, that means something." The kitchen stayed quiet. Clara picked up the letter, folded it, put it in her pocket. "All right," she said. "Write to Helena." She walked back out to the bunkhouse. She had 7 children waiting. And outside, somewhere east of Montana, a man who considered her property had just learned which direction she'd run. The month's advantage Silas had spoken of so calmly had already started to count down. The letter from Helena arrived 9 days after Silas sent his inquiry. Jonah brought it in from town with the rest of the week's mail, set it on the table in front of Silas without comment, and went back outside. That was Jonah's way. Deliver the thing, don't editorialize. Let the thing be what it is. Silas read it twice before he said anything to anyone. Then he folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and went to find Clara. She was in the bunkhouse room with the children, middle of the morning lesson. He stopped at the doorway and waited because whatever was in that letter had waited 9 days and could wait another 10 minutes. Through the open door, he could hear her voice, patient, clear, with that particular quality it had when she was teaching, like she had dialed down everything unnecessary and left only the essential. She was working with the older Henderson boy on long division, and the boy was frustrated, and Clara was not rushing him or softening the difficulty. She was just staying with him, present and steady, refusing to let him quit. The boy got it. Silas heard the moment it happened, a shift in the quality of silence, and then the boy said, "Oh," in the voice of someone who has just understood something real. "There it is," Clara said, quietly, like it mattered. It did matter. That was the thing about her that Silas was still getting used to. She treated every small thing like it mattered, not because she was performing care, but because she actually believed it. The Henderson boys' understanding of long division mattered. The Greer girls' comfort on the first morning had mattered. The correctness of the ranch's account books, which she had noticed were 3 months behind and offered to update without being asked, had mattered. Everything she touched, she took seriously. Silas leaned against the doorframe and waited. When the lesson finished and the children filed out, Clara looked up and saw him. She read his face the way she read most things, quickly, accurately, without making a production of it. "Helena wrote back," she said. "Yes." She dismissed the last child, a small alderman boy, who left reluctantly, clearly hoping to hear something interesting. When he was gone, Clara stood and crossed to where Silas was standing. She didn't ask him to hand her the letter. She waited. "The arrangement your father signed," Silas said, "is not a marriage contract. It's a promissory agreement, essentially a financial instrument. Your father borrowed money from Harrington's family, and the arrangement was structured as collateral. You were listed as the mechanism of repayment, not a party to the contract." Clara's face did not change. "I know," she said. "I read it before I left." "Then you know what the judge said." "Tell me anyway." "In Montana territory, that kind of agreement has no legal standing to compel a person. Harrington can pursue your father for the debt. He cannot pursue you. Not here. Not under territorial law." The silence stretched out. "He'll argue it differently," Clara said. "He'll find a way to frame it that sounds legal. He has people who know how to do that." "I know," Silas said, "which is why the judge also said this." He pulled the letter from his pocket and read the relevant section directly, because some things are better in their own words. The judge had written that if Miss Bennett was residing on the property as a contracted or prospective spouse of a territorial resident, her status as a resident herself would be substantially strengthened, and any attempt by an outside party to remove her against her will would constitute unlawful seizure under territorial statute. He folded the letter again. Clara was very still. "He's saying," she said slowly, "that if I were engaged to someone here, yes. Harrington couldn't touch me legally. Not without territorial authorization, which he'd have to apply for, which would take months, which buys time for a proper legal challenge." She looked at him. He looked at her. The space between them felt different than it had that morning. Not bigger, just more aware of itself. "I'm not asking you to marry me," Silas said carefully. "I'm telling you what the judge said. What you do with it is your business." "Is it?" she said, not quite a question. "Yes," he said. "Always." She turned away, walked to the window, stood there with her back to him, and he could see the thinking happening, could see it in the tension of her shoulders, the slight movement of her hand against her side, the way her head tilted just fractionally as she worked through angles and implications and costs and variables. "This isn't the life I planned," she said finally to the window. "No," he said, "mine either." She turned around. Her expression had settled into something he recognized by now, that particular look of a woman who has made a decision and is choosing to stand in it rather than fall into it. "Give me a week," she said, "to think." "Take two," he said. "We still have time." He left her there and went back to work. He did not let himself think about the letter in his pocket or the way the morning light had caught the side of her face when she turned away from him. He went back to the barn and he picked up the thing he'd been working on before, and he worked on it because that was what you did. You worked, and you waited, and you tried not to grab at things before they were ready. The week she'd asked for lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, she came to breakfast and sat across from him and said without preamble, "All right." Caleb looked up from his plate. Jonah didn't look up, but went very still. Silas said, "All right what?" "All right to the arrangement," she said. "Engagement on paper for legal standing, until this is resolved." She looked at him with those clear gray eyes that never quite showed everything they contained. "I'm not agreeing to more than that. I'm not agreeing to things I haven't decided yet. But the legal protection makes sense, and I'm not going to refuse sense on principle." "That's fair," Silas said. "I have conditions." "Tell me." She held up one finger. "I keep teaching. That's not negotiable." Second finger. "I keep my own money from whatever the school arrangement produces." Third. She paused. "You don't lie to me. About anything. Not to protect me, not to spare my feelings, not because you think I can't handle something. You tell me the truth, and you let me handle it." The kitchen was quiet. "Done," Silas said. All three. She lowered her hand, nodded once, reached for her coffee like they had just agreed on fence repairs. Caleb exhaled slowly. Jonah picked up his fork and resumed eating. And Silas, who had not felt anything that resembled hope in close to 2 years, sat with the unfamiliar weight of it pressing against the inside of his chest, and told himself to be careful with it. 3 days later, Jonah came back from town riding faster than usual. Silas saw him from the gate and felt it before Jonah reached him, that particular quality of speed that is not urgency about something manageable. That is the speed of a man who has seen something worth running from. Jonah pulled up, swung down, and said 4 words. "Harrington's man is here." Silas went still. "In town, asking questions at the dry goods, described Clara exactly, offered money for information." Jonah's jaw was tight. "Mrs. Alderman overheard. Sent word with the Henderson boy before I left." "How long ago?" 2 hours. 2 hours. Silas calculated the distances, the roads, the time it would take for an Eastern man who didn't know the valley to narrow a description to an address. Not long enough. "Where's Clara?" he said. "Bunkhouse." He was already moving. She took it the way she took most things, straight on. No flinching, her chin coming up slightly, the way it did when she was absorbing something she'd already half expected. "How much does the man know?" she asked. "Enough that we don't have days," Silas said. "Maybe not hours." She nodded. One short, precise nod. Then she looked at the 7 children still seated in the room with the bewildered expressions of children who understand that something adult and serious has entered the atmosphere without understanding what it is. "Class is finished for today," she told them in a tone that was warm enough not to frighten them and firm enough that no one argued. "Tell your families, missus. Tell them Miss Bennett will see you Thursday." They filed out. The youngest Greer girl stopped at the door and held the Riverstone up briefly, the one Clara had given her on the first morning. A small gesture that meant something neither of them needed to name. "Thursday," Clara told her. The girl left. Clara turned back to Silas. "What do we do?" "Right now, we do nothing differently," he said. "If we bolt, it looks like running. If we stay and he comes here, we're on our ground, not his. He'll bring lawyers. Let him. The judge's letter establishes our position. He paused. But I need you to understand this will be unpleasant. Harrington is going to say things about you in front of people. It's how men like him work. They control the story. Something moved across her face. Not fear. Something older than fear. I know, she said. I've heard the story he tells about me. What does he say? She looked at the window. That I'm unstable, impulsive, that I broke a legal agreement and humiliated a good man. That I need to be returned to my family for my own protection. Her voice was flat, the flatness of something that has been said so many times it has lost its ability to wound, or almost. He's been telling it for months, since before I left. He started the story before you ran, Silas said. He knew I was thinking about it. She looked back at Silas. Edward is very good at being ahead of things. Silas held her gaze. So are you, he said. She almost said something. He saw it, the response forming, and then being evaluated, and then being set aside. Instead, she said, What do you need from me? Exactly what you've been doing, he said. Nothing more. Harrington's man arrived the following afternoon. He was not Harrington himself that came later. This was a representative, a lawyer named Stills from a firm in Boston who rode in on a hired horse and dismounted in the yard with the careful movements of a man who does not spend much time on horseback and is determined not to show it. He was polite. He was smooth. He had a briefcase. Silas met him at the gate. Mr. Walker, Stills said. He had the voice of a courtroom, modulated precise, the kind of voice trained to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things. I represent Mr. Edward Harrington of Boston. I believe you have a Miss Clara Bennett residing on your property. I have a Miss Bennett, Silas said. She resides here by her own choice. Yes, well. Stills opened the briefcase on the fence post with the practiced efficiency of a man who has done this many times. The matter of Miss Bennett's presence in Montana is somewhat complicated by certain prior legal arrangements which I've corresponded with the territorial circuit judge in Helena about those arrangements, Silas said. If you'd like, I can show you his response. Stills paused. Something shifted behind his professional composure. When did you? 3 weeks ago. Silas looked at him steadily. I like to be prepared. The lawyer recalibrated. Silas could see it happening, the adjustment of approach, the reassessment of the situation. He'd come expecting to deliver papers to a frontier rancher who didn't know the legal landscape. He had not come expecting a frontier rancher who had already been in correspondence with a circuit judge. Be that as it may, Stills said, recovering smoothly, Mr. Harrington has expressed a desire to speak with Miss Bennett personally. To ensure she is here of her own will, and not under any. She's here of her own will, Silas said. She's also my fiancée, which the judge has confirmed gives her full residential standing under territorial law. If Mr. Harrington wants to pursue the debt arrangement with her father, he's welcome to do that through the appropriate channels. But Miss Bennett is not available to be spoken to by representatives of a man who has no legal claim over her in this territory. Stills stared at him. Fiancé, he said. That's correct. A long pause. When did this? Recently, Silas said. Is there anything else? Stills closed the briefcase. Mr. Harrington will want to hear this himself. He's welcome to come, Silas said. This is a free territory. He can ride up the South Road the same as anyone else, but he'll find the same answer when he gets here. Stills mounted his horse with less grace than he dismounted. He rode back down the South Road without another word. Silas stood at the gate and watched him go. Behind him, from the direction of the main house porch, he heard Caleb say quietly, He's going to come himself. I know, Silas said. You ready for that? Silas thought about what ready meant in the context of a man like Edward Harrington. A man with money and lawyers, and the particular certainty of someone who had never been told no by anyone with the power to make it stick. No, he said honestly, but he isn't either. Harrington arrived 4 days later. He came in a hired coach, which was not a practical choice for the South Road, and was almost certainly a deliberate one. A statement about resources, about the kind of man who could import his own comfort into an inconvenient landscape. He was younger than Silas had expected. 32, maybe 33. Well-built. The kind of handsome that comes from good nutrition, and the right barber and clothes that cost more than the ranch's monthly operating expenses. He moved with the ease of a man who has never once doubted that the room he walks into will arrange itself around him. He looked at Silas the way certain men look at other men, the rapid, comprehensive assessment that is simultaneously polite and dismissive. Taking inventory. Filing the result. "Mr. Walker," he said. His voice was what Silas would have predicted. Educated, controlled, and carrying the faint texture of someone who is always the most important person in the room and knows it. "I appreciate you receiving me." "You're on a public road," Silas said. "I didn't receive you. You arrived." A fractional pause. "Yes." Harrington smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm and about as genuine as a painted window. "I'd like to speak with Clara." "I'm aware." "She's inside." "She is." "Then if you'd—" "She knows you're here," Silas said. "If she wants to see you, she'll come out." Harrington's smile thinned at the edges. "Not much. Just enough." "I see. Your man in town said you'd described yourself as her fiancé, was it?" "That's correct." "That's quite sudden. Life out here moves fast," Silas said. Harrington looked at him for a moment with something behind the practiced ease that was sharper and colder. He was recalculating the same way Stills had recalculated, but with more resources to bring to the adjustment. "She's a remarkable woman," Harrington said pleasantly. "I've known her family for years. Her father is a good man in difficult circumstances. I've tried to help them." "By arranging his daughter as payment for a loan," Silas said. "By creating a mutually beneficial arrangement. Clara didn't benefit." "Clara," Harrington said with the studied patience of someone correcting a fundamental misunderstanding, "was given every advantage of my family's name and resources. What she did was impulsive and frankly dangerous. Coming out here alone in this heat, she nearly died getting here," Silas said, "because she was running from something worth running from. And she made it. And she's been here 5 weeks, and she's built a school for Valley children, and she's made herself useful in ways that have nothing to do with anyone's name or anyone's arrangements." He kept his voice even, level. "She's not what you said she was. You know that." Harrington looked at him. For the first time, the pleasantness dropped entirely. Just for a moment. Just long enough to show what was underneath it, which was not warmth and not reasonableness, but something much simpler and much colder. The face of a man who is genuinely unaccustomed to obstacles. "I'd like to speak with her," he said again. "You'd like to," Silas said. "That's not the same as getting to." The sound of the front door opening ended the standoff. Clara walked across the yard. She moved the way she always moved, head up, shoulders set, covering ground without rushing it. She was wearing the same clothes she taught, in which was a choice Silas recognized immediately. She had not changed. She had not dressed for Harrington's arrival. She had come out as herself in her own time on her own terms. She stopped beside Silas. She did not stand behind him. She stood beside him. There was a difference that Harrington, who was the kind of man who noticed everything that suggested power, clearly registered. "Edward," she said. "Clara." Something in Harrington's voice changed. Not softer exactly, but more particular. Like she was a specific problem, and the rest of the situation was general. "You look well." "I am well," she said. "The journey must have been—" "I know what the journey was," she said. "I made it." A silence. "Your father is worried," Harrington said. "My father sold me to cover a debt," she said. Clear, clean, no bitterness, just fact. "He can be worried. That doesn't make what he did different." Harrington's jaw shifted slightly. "The arrangement. has no legal standing in this territory, Clara said. I know. Silas wrote to the circuit judge. I read the response. She looked at Harrington steadily. You came a long way for nothing, Edward. I came, he said. And the pleasantness had gone entirely now, the real texture of the man coming through. Because a significant financial arrangement was broken, and a woman under my family's protection disappeared in the middle of the night. I came because I have a responsibility. You don't, she said. You have an investment. There's a difference. She paused. And the investment was in my father, not in me. Harrington looked at her for a long moment, then at Silas, then back at her. You've decided, he said. I decided before I left Boston, she said. I just needed somewhere to land. Something crossed Harrington's face that might in a different man have been the beginning of something real. A genuine recognition of something lost, or maybe never had. But it moved through and was gone before it could become anything replaced by the familiar smoothness, the recalibration, the adjustment of strategy. I won't accept this immediately, he said pleasantly. I'll want to consult with my attorneys about the territorial standing you've described. I'm sure you understand. I understand completely, Silas said. You're welcome to stay in town while you do. Aldridge runs a decent boarding house off the main street. Tell him I sent you. Harrington looked at him one more time. It was the look of a man committing something to memory, not a face, but a problem, cataloging it for future reference. Good day, Mr. Walker, he said. Clara. He walked back to the coach. They stood in the yard and watched it turn around and go back down the south road. Clara let out a breath that was controlled on its way out, deliberately slow, the kind of breath that is managing something. Silas felt it more than heard it. He's not done, she said. No. He'll find something, some angle. She pressed her fingers together at her side. Edward doesn't accept outcomes he didn't choose. I know, Silas said. But he doesn't know this valley, and he doesn't know the people in it, and he's working on a clock that runs the same direction as ours. She looked at him sideways. You're not worried. I'm very worried, he said. I'm just not showing it in a way that helps him. That surprised a sound out of her brief, involuntary, the edge of a laugh that she hadn't planned for. You're an unusual man, Silas Walker, she said. You've said that before, he said. It keeps being true. They stood there another moment, both looking at the empty south road. Then Caleb appeared on the porch and said, Is he gone? With the energy of a man who had been watching from the window the entire time. He's gone, Silas said. Good. Caleb came down the steps. Because Jonah made coffee, and it's going to get cold, and we've all been standing around being anxious for 40 minutes, and I think we deserve to sit down. Clara looked at Caleb, then at Silas. He's not wrong, she said. They went inside. The trouble came from a direction none of them had anticipated. It was not legal. It was not Harrington personally. It was the town. Stills, the lawyer, had spent 3 days in Bitter Ridge before Harrington arrived. 3 days was long enough for a man with money to buy drinks at the saloon and let conversations happen. It was long enough to plant certain versions of certain stories. Nothing that could be called slander exactly, just the particular kind of talk that takes root in small communities and is hard to pull out once it's growing. By the time Silas rode into town for supplies 2 days after Harrington's visit, he could feel it before anyone said anything specific. The shift in the way people looked at him. The conversations that moved slightly when he walked in. Mrs. Petra at the dry goods, who had been friendly for the 6 years he'd been coming to her store, was friendly still, but careful with it. The kind of friendly that was keeping its distance. He bought his supplies. He didn't ask. Caleb found out on his own ride in the following morning. He came back and reported with the directness of someone who has decided that good news delivered kindly doesn't help the person who needs to know bad news. They're saying she was promised, Caleb said. That she broke a legal promise and ran. That the man she left, they're not saying abandoned, they're saying left, which sounds worse, is a well-connected Boston family, and that the Walker Ranch has been harboring her against her legitimate obligations. He paused. Some of them are saying she's not what she appears to be, that she's using the school as a way to stay here, that the engagement to you is a convenience she manufactured. Silas sat with this for a long moment. The children, he said. The families who send them to the school. Caleb's expression answered before he did. 2 families have pulled their children. Alderman hasn't, and Henderson hasn't, and the Greers are still sending theirs. But who told Clara? Nobody yet. Silas stood up. She needs to hear it from us. He told her that afternoon. He told her all of it because he had promised to do that, and he was not going to break that particular promise, no matter how much he would have preferred to. He watched her face as he talked. He watched the color change slightly in her cheeks, not flushing the opposite, going a shade more still, and he watched her hands, which had been resting open on the table, curl closed slowly. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that the quality of the silence changed. He planned this, she said. Stills came early on purpose, to seed the ground before Edward arrived, so that by the time Edward was turned away, the story would already be growing. Yes, Silas said. He knew you'd have the legal position. She was thinking aloud now, not looking at him, working through it the way she worked through everything methodically without flinching. He knew the judge's letter would protect me legally, so he moved to the only ground that didn't require law. What people believe about me. Yes, she looked up. And if people here won't trust me, if the families pull their children, then the school collapses. Then I have no standing in this community independent of you. Then I'm just a woman living on a man's ranch, which looks exactly like the story he's been telling. Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight in the way that happened when she was holding something down. He's very good. You're better, Silas said. She looked at him. You're already 3 moves ahead of him in everything that matters, Silas said. He's building a story. You've been building something real. Those aren't the same, and they don't land the same. People who have met you, who have watched you teach their children, they know the difference. 2 families left, she said. 2 families did, he said. 5 didn't. Something shifted in her face. Not relief. Something more complicated than relief, more fragile. The look of a person who has been waiting for someone to say the thing they most need to hear, and then is caught off guard by actually hearing it. I'm afraid, she said. It came out like a confession, like the admission cost her something. I don't say that often, but I want you to know it. I'm not made of stone, and I'm afraid of what he can do. Silas was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. Then carefully, so am I. She looked at him. He's a particular kind of dangerous, Silas said. The kind that uses other people's voices. I know how to handle a man who comes at you directly. This I'm learning. The admission landed between them. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something he had not seen her do before. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, briefly, just for a second, just enough to press down once before pulling back. Then we'll figure it out, she said. She said we. She said it the same way she said everything else, without making a production of it, without underlining it, without letting him see how much it cost her to offer it. She just said it and let it sit. Silas looked at his own hand on the table. Yes, he said, we will. Jonah came back from the east pasture the following morning with a split lip and a silence that was different from his usual kind. Silas saw it immediately. He crossed the yard fast and stopped in front of his younger brother and looked at him, and Jonah looked back with the contained, deliberate expression of a man who is deciding what to say. 2 of Harrington's hired men, Jonah said. On the fence line. They said it was a conversation. He touched the corner of his mouth. It went another way. Silas's whole chest went cold. How many of them? 2 then. A pause. They said there'd be more. The cold in Silas's chest moved. It didn't disappear. It organized. Did they follow you back? No, I made sure. Are you hurt? Jonah's look said what it always said when Silas asked questions whose answers were obvious. I'm standing here, he said. That's not an answer. I'm fine, Jonah said. The lip isn't the point. I know what the point is, Silas said. He stood there for a moment with the cold, organized weight of it in his chest, thinking. Harrington had shifted again. The legal approach had failed. The community story was growing but slowly. And now, men on the fence line. A message delivered in the language of physical force, because some men, when they run out of other tools, fall back to the one they started with. This was no longer about lawyers and letters and territorial judges. Silas turned toward the house. "Get Caleb," he said, "and don't tell Clara yet." "She should know," Jonah said. Silas stopped, turned back. Jonah was watching him with the direct, patient attention of a man who has been watching his older brother make decisions for 20 years and knows when one of them is about to be wrong. "I promised her I'd tell her the truth," Silas said, quietly. "Then tell her the truth," Jonah said. A long pause. "Get Caleb first," Silas said. "Then we'll all sit down." He walked back to the house, and the cold thing in his chest had become something else by the time he reached the door. Something harder. Something that had been a long time forming, shaped by 11 months of silence, and one woman who had arrived in a freight wagon and refused in every way and in everything to be less than exactly who she was. Harrington had made a mistake. He had come to a ranch on open land in a territory where the law favored the people who lived on it, and he had put his hands on Jonah Walker. He had done that, and now he had to live with what came next. They sat at the kitchen table, all four of them. Silas had not planned what he was going to say. He had found over the years that planning speeches for difficult conversations was mostly a way of avoiding the conversation, because the plan never survived contact with the actual people in the room. So he sat down, and he said what had happened plainly and in order, and he watched Clara's face while he said it. She listened, the way she always listened, completely without interrupting, without the small sounds and expressions most people used to show they were following along. She just listened, her hands flat on the table, her eyes on Silas, until he finished. Then she said, "How bad was it?" "Bad enough that they meant it as a message," Silas said. "Not bad enough that they wanted a real fight. Not yet." She looked at Jonah. "Are you all right?" "Fine," Jonah said. Jonah. A pause. "Ribs are sore," he said. "Nothing broken." Her jaw tightened. She looked back at Silas. He's escalating because the legal approach failed. This is what he does. He moves through options until he finds one that works. She pressed her palms flat on the table. "He'll try this for a while. If it doesn't move me, he'll try something else." "What's the something else?" Caleb said. "I don't know," she said, and the honesty in it was the kind that cost something to deliver. "With Edward, I never know exactly. He's patient. He finds the angle that hurts the most, and he uses it." The kitchen was quiet. "He hurt Jonah," Silas said. "That's the angle that hurts the most, far as I'm concerned." Jonah looked at his oldest brother. Something passed between them that didn't need language. "We can't let this become a physical conflict," Clara said, and her voice had a steadiness that Silas recognized as the sound of a woman who has thought about consequences more than most people have. "He has more men than you do, and he has money to bring more. If this becomes a fight, he wins that fight eventually." She looked at Silas directly. "That's not a criticism. It's mathematics." "I know," Silas said. "So, what do we do?" Caleb said. Silas looked at Clara. "You said he finds the angle that hurts the most and uses it. What does that mean for here?" she thought. He could see her working through it, that internal process she ran that was so thorough and so fast that it looked like stillness. "He'll look for something that I can't legally defend against," she said slowly. "The debt is off the table. The judge closed that. The community story is working slowly, but it's not enough for him." She paused. "If I had to guess, he'll go after you." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Not physically," she said. "Financially or legally. Something that gives him leverage over the ranch, which gives him leverage over me. If he can make staying here cost you enough." She stopped, looked at the table. He's calculating whether you'll keep paying that price. The room held that. He's going to be wrong about that calculation, Caleb said, with the flat certainty of a younger brother who has been watching his oldest brother's face during this conversation. Yes, Jonah said. Just the one word. Silas didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just looked at Clara, and Clara looked back, and whatever she found in his expression made something in her own go quiet, not smaller, but stiller. Like something that had been bracing itself stopped bracing. Write to the judge again, she said. Tell him about the men on the fence line. Get it on record. Already planning on it, Silas said. And I need to write a letter of my own. She straightened in her chair. To my father. Caleb looked at her. You sure about that? No, she said honestly. But he signed a contract he had no right to sign over a person who didn't agree to it. And somewhere under the debt and the fear and 30 years of making bad decisions, he knows that. If there's anything left of his conscience, this is when I find out. She paused. And if the letter makes it to Edward before it makes it to my father, which it might, because Edward manages my father's correspondence, then Edward will know that I'm not hiding, and I'm not afraid, and I'm not going to break. A beat. Sometimes the best defense is making clear that you're not running. That's either very smart or very dangerous, Caleb said. Most useful things are both, she said. She wrote the letter that night. Silas heard her at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to sleep, the quiet sound of pen on paper, the occasional pause. The one time he heard her chair push back, and then the silence of someone standing at the window thinking before sitting back down. He did not go out. He lay in the dark of his room and listened to the sounds of her working, and he thought about what it meant that a woman who had every reason to be quiet and careful and hidden was instead at midnight, writing her name into the record of the thing that had been done to her. He had known people he admired in his life, his father, Jonah in his particular way. A rancher 2 valleys over named Cates, who had fought a water claim through 3 years of territorial court and won. People who stood in difficult ground and refused to move for reasons that had nothing to do with stubbornness and everything to do with knowing that the ground they were on was worth standing in. He had not expected to add a 22-year-old woman from Boston to that list. He also had not expected the particular way that list felt different now that she was on it. He stopped thinking about it and made himself sleep. 3 days passed without incident, which was the kind of quiet that was louder than noise. Jonah rode the fence line every morning and came back with nothing to report, which was information in itself. Harrington's men were still out there watching, they just weren't acting. They were waiting for something, for an instruction or a development or a response to a move that hadn't been made yet. The letter to Helena went out with the morning rider. The letter to Clara's father went with the same rider headed east, which either was or wasn't going to matter, depending on things they couldn't control. The school continued. That was Clara's insistence stated plainly the morning after the kitchen conversation. The school doesn't close, she said. If I close the school every time Edward creates a problem, then Edward controls the school. He doesn't get to control the school. 5 children arrived on Tuesday. Still missing the 2 families that had pulled out, but the 5 who came were enough to constitute a school enough to make the point that needed making enough for Clara to teach with the same unhurried focus she brought to everything. As though the fact that a man with hired muscle was watching from outside the valley changed nothing about the importance of the Henderson boys' long division. Mrs. Alderman stopped by on Wednesday afternoon. She came without her children, which meant she came with purpose, and she came in through the front door of the main house, which meant she wanted to talk to someone, not just drop something off. Silas pointed her toward the bunkhouse and went back to the accounts. He heard them talking from across the yard, though not the words. Clara's voice, then Mrs. Alderman's, then Clara's again, for a long stretch without interruption. Then a silence. Then what might have been Mrs. Alderman crying briefly, or laughing. It was hard to tell from a distance which, and sometimes they were the same thing. When Mrs. Alderman left, she walked differently than she'd arrived. Something had released in her shoulders. She stopped at the gate where Silas was pretending to work and said, "She's a good woman, Mr. Walker. Whatever's being said in town, that woman is good." She said it with the directness of someone making a correction to an official record. Then she was gone. Silas looked at the bunkhouse. Clara was standing in the doorway watching Mrs. Alderman's wagon go. She felt him looking and turned. Their eyes met across the yard. She tipped her chin up slightly. That small gesture that he'd come to understand meant she was all right, meant she had handled the thing, meant don't worry about this particular front. He nodded back. He went inside to finish the accounts. The twist came from a direction so unexpected that even afterward, going back through it, Silas could not find the place where he should have seen it coming. It was Caleb who found it. He came in from town on a Thursday morning a week after Jonah's encounter on the fence line, and he was moving wrong. Not fast controlled the way someone moves when they're holding something difficult and don't want to spill it. He came to Silas first, not Clara, which told Silas immediately that whatever it was the kind of thing where the sequence of telling mattered. "I need to show you something," Caleb said. He put a document on the table. It was a land claim, recorded with the Territorial Land Office dated 2 weeks prior, bearing the signature of a man named Fitch as the filing party and buried in the legal language of the third paragraph, the name of the actual interest behind the filing. Harrington Holdings, Boston, Massachusetts. Silas read it twice. "What land?" he said, though some part of him already felt the answer before Caleb gave it. "The South Water Access," Caleb said. "The creek that runs the South Pasture." Silas set the paper down. The South Pasture Creek was not glamorous land. It was not the part of the property anyone would look at and call valuable. But it was the water source for 110 head of cattle in summer, and without it, those cattle needed to be moved north to the main stock tank, which had the capacity for 60 head in dry weather, and summer in Montana was dry weather, and without adequate water in summer, without that particular creek, they would spend the next 3 months running cattle against a water supply that couldn't hold them all. Harrington had not come after the ranch with lawyers. He had come after the water. "How is this possible?" Silas said. The question was controlled. He was keeping it controlled. "That land has been ours since Dad filed the original claim in '64, Caleb said. "But the original filing." Silas, the original filing had a boundary description that was written by hand, and Dad's handwriting was terrible, Silas said. "The creek boundary line is ambiguous," Caleb said. "Fitch, whoever Fitch is, he's probably a man Harrington hired, filed a counterclaim arguing that the creek falls outside our documented boundary by 60 yards. He paused. The land office accepted it for review. The thing in Silas's chest that had organized itself after Jonah came home with a split lip reorganized now into something quieter and more focused. He picked the paper up, set it back down, looked at his younger brother. "He's been planning this since before he arrived," he said. "Has to be," Caleb said. The filing was dated before he even rode out here. He came to the ranch already knowing about the creek. The visit was assessment, Silas said. He was checking whether we knew. A pause. "We didn't. We do now." "Yes." Silas folded the document carefully. "We do now." He stood at the table for a moment that stretched longer than its actual seconds. Then he said, "Don't tell Clara yet." Caleb looked at him. "I know," Silas said. "I know. But I need an hour to think before we have that conversation. And I am asking you for 1 hour, Caleb, before this becomes a conversation that can't be unhad." Caleb was quiet. Then, "1 hour," he said. Silas took the document and his hat and walked out to the south pasture. He stood at the creek for a long time. He knew every inch of this water. He had grown up next to it, had fixed the banks twice, after heavy spring rains had pulled cattle out of it 3 times when the mud went soft in late spring. His father had brought him here when he was 7 years old and said in the simple and irrefutable way that his father had said things, "You take care of the water takes care of everything else." He thought about Edward Harrington in a Boston office looking at maps, identifying the pressure point with the clinical efficiency of a man who treats other people's lives as engineering problems. Finding the creek, filing the claim, coming to the ranch to watch whether they knew, and they hadn't. They hadn't known, and now Harrington had leverage that existed entirely outside the territory's protective legal framework, because it wasn't about Clara anymore. It was about water, and about whether Silas was willing to let a man who had never set foot in this valley own the thing his father had told him to take care of. He was not. He walked back to the house. He found Clara in the kitchen. He set the document in front of her and sat down across from her and said, "I promised you the truth." And then he told her. She read it. She read it again. He watched her face, watched the understanding land, watched her trace the logic of it, watched her arrive at the same conclusion he had. She set the paper down. "He found the weak point," she said. "Yes." "This is because of me," she said. Not with guilt exactly, more with the precision of someone identifying a causal relationship. "If I weren't here, he'd have no reason to pursue the creek." "If you weren't here," Silas said, "he'd have no reason to pursue anything on this property. But you are here, and I'm not asking you to leave so we can retire that possibility right now." She looked up at him sharply. "The water," Silas said, "is my problem to fix. I'm asking for your help, fixing it, not for you to take responsibility for it." "What kind of help?" she said immediately. She had let the guilt, or whatever had crossed her face, pass through and be done with it. That was one of the things about her he had stopped being surprised by, and started simply relying on. She didn't linger in feelings that weren't useful. "The original land claim," he said. "My father's filing in '64. If the boundary description is ambiguous, we need to prove what the intended boundary was, which means we need documentation that establishes the creek as part of this property, letters, receipts, anything that shows the creek has been used and maintained as part of this ranch for 20 years. He paused. "And we need someone who can read the legal language of a territorial counterclaim and tell us where its weak points are." "The circuit judge in Helena," she said. "He's the one we've been writing to, but I need to know if he can be here. In person." "There needs to be a hearing," Silas said. "On the land, not in a letter, in person in front of people on the record. Harrington can fight letters. He can't as easily fight a territorial judge who has ridden out to stand on the actual ground and look at the actual creek." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and went to the shelf where she kept her paper and pen. "I'll write to the judge," she said. "I write to him more legibly than you do." Silas looked at her. She glanced back. "I've seen your handwriting," she said. "It's not your strength." Something shifted in his chest, something that had been wound tight for the better part of an hour, loosened just slightly without entirely releasing. "It's not," he agreed. She sat down and started writing. 4 days later, 2 things happened in the same afternoon. The first was that Mrs. Henderson arrived at the ranch with her 2 children and a covered dish, and a look on her face that said she had made a decision and intended to stand behind it. "We're coming back," she said to Clara in the tone of someone making a public statement. "Whatever's being said in town, my children are coming back to school." Clara received this the way she received most good things, with a quiet directness that didn't make a performance of gratitude, but made it completely clear that the gesture had landed. "Thursday," she said. "Bring them Thursday." Mrs. Henderson nodded, left the covered dish, and went home. That was the first thing. The second was that Jonah came in from the east fence line with a different kind of report than the ones before it. "They moved the watch," he said. Silas looked up. "Where?" "North fence, closer to the house." A pause. "And they're 3 now, not 2. The number had gone up. Silas absorbed this. "They're not here to talk anymore," he said. "No," Jonah said. "They're not." Caleb came in from the other room where he'd been close enough to hear. "What do we do?" "We send for the sheriff," Silas said. "Tonight, not tomorrow. Jonah rides before dark." "The sheriff's been careful about this," Caleb said. He doesn't want to put himself between Harrington's money and a territorial rancher. He's going to have to pick a side, Silas said, because what's on the north fence is no longer a matter of land claims and legal filings. That's 3 men positioned close enough to the house to be a threat to the people in it. He looked at Caleb, then Jonah. We're not asking the sheriff for permission. We're putting him on record. If something happens here and the sheriff was notified and didn't respond, that's a fact that belongs in front of the circuit judge. Jonah was already reaching for his coat. Tell him what Jonah saw, Clara said from the kitchen doorway. They all turned. She had heard everything which he should have expected. She was standing there with the letter to the judge still in her hand. Tell him exactly 3 men, north fence date and time, and tell him the circuit judge has been notified of the land dispute. She paused. A sheriff who's been careful becomes less careful when he realizes a territorial judge is already watching. Silas looked at her. She looked back with the expression of a woman who has been paying attention to how power works for 22 years and has learned things from it. She's right, Jonah said. He took the letter from Clara's hand on his way to the door. Stopped and looked at her for a moment with the direct, silent assessment that was how Jonah expressed things most people would have needed several sentences for. Then he nodded once and went out. The door closed. Caleb exhaled. How worried should we be? He asked. To Silas, but also to Clara, the way questions were starting to be asked in this house to both of them, like they were already the kind of unit that made decisions together. Silas looked at Clara. Clara looked at Silas. Worried enough to be careful, she said. Not worried enough to be afraid. She paused. There's a difference. The judge's reply arrived in 6 days, which was faster than anything else had moved in this entire situation, and which meant Silas thought that the judge had understood the urgency. The letter was brief and completely clear. Circuit Judge Harold T. Marin would be in Bitter Ridge Valley within 10 days. He would conduct a formal hearing on the land counterclaim at a time and location to be announced. He had reviewed the documentation provided and had questions that required in-person examination of the physical boundary in dispute. He had also in the final paragraph noted that it had come to his attention that 1 or more private citizens had been engaged in intimidation conduct in relation to the parties in this dispute, and that he considered this relevant to the proceedings. Silas read that final paragraph twice. He knows about the fencemen, Clara said. He knows, Silas said. The sheriff must have written to him, or the sheriff reported to someone who did. He folded the letter. Either way, Harrington's tactics are on the judge's radar before he even gets here. Which means Harrington knows they're on the radar. He'll pull the men back, Clara said immediately. Yes, to look cooperative. And then what does he do? Silas thought about it. Something we haven't predicted yet, he said. She nodded. She had expected that answer. What neither of them could have predicted was what happened 2 mornings before the judge was due to arrive when Caleb shook Silas awake at 4:30 with a face that stopped Silas's heart for a full second before Caleb spoke. Clara's gone, Caleb said. Silas was out of bed before the sentence finished. Her room is empty, Caleb said, and her coat is gone and Silas was already in the hallway. He went to her room. The bed was made, which meant she'd made it, which meant she'd left deliberately and not in distress, but also that she'd left before dawn without telling anyone, which was not like her, which was not like the woman who had looked him in the eye and said, "We'll figure it out." On the pillow was a folded piece of paper. He picked it up. Her handwriting. Controlled and precise, the same as always, except for a slight pressure variation in the pen strokes that told him this had not been as calm to write as it looked. Silas. I've gone to meet Harrington. He sent word last night through Mrs. Alderman, who I should have told you about immediately and didn't. He says he'll drop the land claim entirely in exchange for a private conversation with me. I know what you'll say. I know you'll say it's a trap, and you may be right. But if there's a chance I can end this before the hearing before he damages anything else that matters on this ranch, I have to take it. I'm meeting him at the Alderman barn at sunrise. Don't come. I mean that. See. Silas read it once. Then he handed it to Caleb. "Saddle the horses," he said. "She said—" "I know what she said," Silas said. "Saddle the horses." He was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. He did not think she was wrong to go. He understood the logic. She was trying to protect something the same way she always tried to protect something, by stepping in front of it herself before it could be damaged further. He understood it, and he respected it, and he was also completely unwilling to let her be alone in a barn with Edward Harrington. And whatever Harrington had decided was his last available move, because a man who had run out of legal options and whose tactical approach had been reported to a circuit judge had very little left. And very little left in a man like Harrington was the most dangerous position there was. Jonah fell in beside him without being asked, which was exactly what Jonah always did. The sun was just beginning to break the horizon when the 3 Walker brothers rode toward the Alderman property at a speed that covered the ground between here and there in a way that left no room for doubt about where they were going or why. What Silas found when he arrived at the barn was not what he expected. And nothing that happened in the next 10 minutes was anything any of them had planned for. The Alderman barn was quiet when Silas pulled his horse up outside it. Too quiet. Not the quiet of an empty place. The quiet of a place where people were being very still. He felt it before he heard anything, the particular compressed silence of a situation that was holding its breath. He swung down. Jonah and Caleb were beside him in seconds, and he put one hand up, wait before either of them moved toward the door. He needed 10 seconds to read this before he walked into it. One voice inside, male, low and controlled. Harrington. Then Clara's voice, steady, answering something. Then a third voice he didn't recognize. That was the thing he hadn't expected. Not Harrington alone, not even Harrington with Stills the lawyer. A third voice, rougher, with the particular quality of a man who was in the room because of what he could do with his hands, not what he could do with words. Silas looked at Jonah. Jonah had already heard it. He gave one small nod. Silas went through the door. The scene arranged itself in front of him in the time it took to cross the threshold. Clara stood near the center of the barn, not bound, not visibly harmed, but positioned in the way that a person stands when they are surrounded and have decided not to show that it matters. Her chin was up, her hands were at her sides. She had planted herself in that particular way she had, like she'd decided where she was standing, and the ground had simply agreed to hold her. Harrington stood 12 feet from her. Behind him, slightly to the right, was a large man in a coat that was too heavy for summer. The third presence. He wasn't touching anything. He didn't need to. His presence was itself a statement. Stills. The lawyer stood near the far wall, with a document case open, and the particular expression of a man who is professionally obligated to be here and personally wishes he were anywhere else. Harrington turned when Silas came through the door. His expression shifted not to surprise but to something more calculated. A rapid reassessment. His eyes went to Jonah, then Caleb, then back to Silas, taking the inventory the way he always did, filing the result. "Mr. Walker," he said, pleasantly, as though this were a scheduled meeting. "I specifically asked to speak with Clara alone." "I know," Silas said. He didn't stop walking until he was standing beside Clara, close enough that she could feel he was there without having to look. "She left a note. The note brought me here." He looked at the large man against the wall. "You want to introduce your friend?" Harrington didn't look at the man. "He's here for my security." "Is he?" Silas said. "The frontier makes me nervous," Harrington said with a lightness that didn't belong in this barn at this hour. "The frontier isn't what should be making you nervous," Silas said. The air in the barn had a weight to it, not hostile yet, but loaded the way air gets before a storm commits to itself. Clara spoke before it could tip further. "He came to make an offer," she said. Her voice was flat and informational. She was not performing calm. She actually had it, which was either extraordinary or the most convincing thing Silas had ever witnessed. "Tell him what you told me, Edward." Same words. Harrington smoothed his coat front with one hand. "I'm prepared to withdraw the land claim," he said. The creek, the boundary dispute. All of it dropped paperwork filed with the land office by the end of the week. The counterclaim disappears as though it never existed. In exchange for what? Silas said. Clara comes back to Boston with me, Harrington said. Voluntarily. No force, no legal proceedings. She returns, we honor the original arrangement, and everything here goes back to what it was before she arrived. The barn was very quiet. Silas didn't look at Clara. He didn't need to. That's not an offer, he said. That's the same position you've had since you rode up the South Road. You've just moved the bargaining chip. The bargaining chip, Harrington said with a patience that was starting to show its seams, is your water supply. Without that creek, I move cattle, Silas said. It's hard, and it's expensive, and it's a bad summer, but I move cattle. I've done it before. He paused. You researched this land looking for the thing that would hurt the most. You found the creek, and your calculation was that I'd trade her to keep it. Harrington said nothing. You were wrong, Silas said. Something moved across Harrington's face. It was brief, and it was real, and it was the first genuinely unguarded expression Silas had seen from him. Not anger exactly, but something underneath anger. The face of a man confronting a type of reasoning he cannot fully understand because it operates on values he does not share. She's a financial obligation, Harrington said. Her father made a bad decision, Silas said. That's his to live with. She doesn't carry it for him. The law. The circuit judge arrives in 2 days, Silas said. You know that. Your lawyer knows that. The law you're citing is Boston law, and this isn't Boston. Harrington turned to Clara. The calculated composure was still there, but thinner now, the framework showing through. Clara, he said, and for the first time there was something in how he said her name that wasn't about ownership. Something that might have been in a different man, in a different life, the remnant of something real. You're choosing this land, this distance, these people, over everything you had. I didn't have anything, she said quietly. I had the appearance of things. There's a difference. You could give me your name, she said. Your resources. Your family's standing. I know. You've explained what you could give. She held his gaze. You never once asked what I wanted. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't recover easily. Harrington turned to Stills. Some wordless communication passed between them, the look of a man acknowledging without saying it, that a particular approach has run its course. Then the man in the heavy coat shifted. It was a small movement, just weight redistributed, 1 foot moving slightly forward, shoulders changing their angle. But Jonah was already moving before it registered for anyone else in the room, crossing the distance between the door and the man in 3 steps that were fast and entirely silent. He stopped directly in front of him. They were roughly the same size. The man looked at Jonah. Jonah looked back. He didn't say anything. He just looked with the patient, complete attention of a man who has been tracking things his whole life and is very good at being exactly where he needs to be. The man in the coat went still. I'd like to leave, the man said. To Harrington, not to Jonah, because it was clear that whatever was going to happen next about leaving was going to be determined by Jonah. Harrington looked at Jonah, then at Silas. Call him off, he said. He's not a dog, Silas said. He makes his own decisions. Jonah stepped to the side. The man walked out. The door didn't bang. He was careful about that. He pulled it quietly behind him, which was somehow more telling than if he'd slammed it, the care of a man who has just recalibrated, who was in charge of this particular situation. Harrington looked at Silas for a long moment. Then, with the deliberate movement of a man making a visible choice to stand down, he sat on a hay bale near the wall. The posture change was significant. He went from positioned to seated, from controlling the geography of the room to simply occupying a part of it. Sit down, he said, to everyone but to Silas specifically. Silas sat. Caleb leaned against the wall. Jonah stayed near the door. Clara sat across from Harrington, with her hands folded in her lap, and the particular stillness of someone who has moved past the worst of what they feared and is now simply watching what comes next. "My family's money is in her father's business," Harrington said. Not the smooth version of the sentence, but the actual one. $300,000. Loans, investments, partnerships over 15 years. When Bennett's business started failing 3 years ago, not recently, 3 years ago, my family held on because the arrangement existed. Because the plan was to consolidate through marriage and recover the position that way. He paused. "I want you to understand, it wasn't only about her." "I know," Clara said. "I've always known." "That doesn't make it—" "It makes it very clear what I was for," she said. "Yes, I've known for a long time." He looked at her. Really looked at her the way he perhaps hadn't allowed himself to before, not as a variable in a financial structure, not as an escaped obligation, but as a person who had known exactly what she was worth to him and left anyway. "You weren't unhappy," he said. "Before, you weren't—" "I was disappearing," she said. Slowly. Becoming smaller and more appropriate and less myself. "I wasn't unhappy the way people are unhappy in a story. I was unhappy the way people are unhappy in a life, quietly without drama, in ways you can almost convince yourself aren't real." She paused. "You didn't see it because you weren't looking for it. You were looking at the arrangement." The barn held that. Harrington pressed his hands flat on his knees. "My family loses the investment if the arrangement dissolves entirely," he said. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand," she said. "Is there a version of this that—" "Talk to my father," she said. "About the debt. About a repayment structure that doesn't require a person as collateral. If he's willing to work honestly toward the debt, and if your family is willing to accept that, then there's a version of this where nobody loses more than money." She paused. "Money can be recovered. Some things can't." Harrington was quiet. "She's right," Still said from the wall. The word came out like it surprised him slightly. He cleared his throat. "From a pure legal standpoint, the circuit judge is going to rule against the counterclaim. The boundary documentation we have is insufficient to override 20 years of established use. And if the intimidation conduct is entered into the record—" He stopped, looked at Harrington. "We're exposed, Edward, on multiple fronts." Harrington looked at his lawyer for a long moment. The kind of look that moves through several emotions in quick succession without settling on any of them. Then he looked at Silas. "The creek," he said. "I withdraw the counterclaim." "In writing," Silas said. "Before you leave this valley." "In writing," Harrington agreed. "Today." Today. The word landed and sat and was real. Caleb let out a breath from his spot against the wall. It was barely audible, but in that barn at that moment it was the sound of something ending. Stills produced the paperwork with the efficiency of a lawyer who is very good at his job, even when his job is producing documents he hadn't expected to produce that morning. The withdrawal of the land counterclaim was signed and witnessed within the hour, with Jonah and Caleb as witnesses in the Alderman barn, while Mrs. Alderman herself appeared in the doorway, at some point, took in the scene with the comprehensive assessment of a woman who has seen a great deal of frontier drama in her time, and quietly produced coffee for everyone, without being asked. It was, Silas thought, the most Montana thing that had happened in this entire situation. Harrington signed without fanfare. He capped his pen, straightened his coat, and stood. He looked at Clara one last time. "Your father will need to hear from you," he said. "Directly. What you said about a repayment structure. He won't accept it from me." "I'll write to him," she said. "I was going to anyway." He nodded. Something in the nod was complicated, not gracious exactly, but honest in a way that the rest of him had rarely been. The admission of a man who has lost a thing he pursued, and is choosing in the end not to pursue it into territory where it will only cost more. "He chose better than he knew," Harrington said. And it was ambiguous. He could have meant her father's choice of the arrangement, or something else entirely. Clara chose not to clarify it, Silas chose not to ask. Harrington walked out. Stills followed with the briefcase, and the sound of the hired coach moving back down the Alderman Road was the most relief Silas had felt in longer than he could easily measure. Clara sat in the quiet of the barn for a moment without moving. Then she turned and looked at Silas with an expression that had several things in it at once, and was not trying to sort them into order. "I told you not to come," she said. "You did," he said. "I meant it." "I know." A pause. "I'm glad you came," she said. It came out simply, without performance, without the careful composure that usually framed everything she said. Just the true version of the sentence. "I know that too," he said. Caleb made a sound that was unmistakably a smothered laugh and turned it into a cough so poorly that nobody was convinced. Jonah looked at the ceiling. "Let's go home," Clara said, and she stood, and the word home sat in the air of the Alderman barn with a weight and a rightness that none of them remarked on, because some things are too true to need remarking. The circuit judge arrived 2 days later as promised. Judge Harold Marin was 61 years old, spare and dry as a fence post, with eyes that had the particular quality of a man who has heard every possible version of every possible story and retains the capacity to be surprised by exactly none of them. He arrived with a clerk and a deputy, and the signed withdrawal of the land counterclaim, which had been filed with the land office the previous afternoon by Stills before the coach left the valley. The hearing was brief. It lasted 40 minutes, conducted in the main room of the Bitter Ridge Courthouse, with 7 Valley residents in attendance, which was every resident who could get there on short notice, and most of whom had come as much out of community solidarity as legal interest. Mrs. Alderman sat in the front row. Mrs. Henderson brought her 2 children, who sat with remarkable patience for children, and slightly less remarkable patience for everyone around them. The Greer family occupied 1 full bench. The judge reviewed the land documentation, the withdrawal, the letters exchanged with Silas over the preceding weeks, and the sheriff's report of the fence line incident. He asked 4 questions. He heard 3 statements. Then he declared the boundary of Bitter Ridge Ranch to include the South Creek in its entirety, with the declaration entered into the permanent territorial record in language that was not ambiguous. He did this in a voice that suggested he was mildly annoyed that anyone had thought this required his personal attention, which was the highest compliment available in his limited emotional register. When it was over, he shook Silas's hand, then Clara's. He held her hand a moment longer than was strictly procedural, and said in a tone that was almost avuncular, "You write a very clear letter, Miss Bennet." "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. "The school teaching is a good use of your time," he said. "This valley needs it." He released her hand. "Carry on." He left to ride the next case on his circuit, which was apparently a water dispute 2 valleys over, that sounded significantly less interesting than this one had been, based on the expression of the clerk who described it while helping the judge to his horse. The walk back to the ranch from the courthouse was 3 miles, and Silas and Clara made it alone, because Caleb had gone ahead with the wagon, and Jonah had ridden back at a pace that suggested he had things to check on that couldn't wait. Which left the 2 of them on the road in the late afternoon heat of a Montana summer, walking at the pace of people who are not in a hurry to be anywhere because where they're going is already theirs. They were half a mile from the courthouse before either of them said anything. "What happens now?" Clara said. Not anxiously, just as a genuine question about the terrain ahead. "With the ranch," Silas said. "With all of it," she said. He considered. "The school continues," he said. "The Henderson boy is going to have long division down by end of summer if you keep after him the way you have been." "He will?" she said. "He's stubborn, but he's not slow." "Stubborn is better." "The barn roof still needs work," Silas said. "I've been putting it off because the summer's been complicated. I'll get to it in the next 2 weeks before the weather changes." She nodded. "The engagement," he said, and he said it carefully. "The way you say something you've been carrying for a while and are finally setting down was for legal protection. That's what we said. I want to be clear that I know that." She was quiet for a few steps. "I know you know that," she said, "and I don't want you to feel—" He stopped, tried again. "You've been very clear from the beginning about not wanting to be in a situation where someone expects something from you without asking. So, I'm asking." He kept his voice even. Not tentative. He wasn't tentative, that wasn't the right word. More like deliberate. Careful with the thing because the thing mattered. "If the engagement is just the paper, then it's just the paper, and we don't discuss it further. If it's something else, then I'd like to know that too. But either way, the answer is yours, and I won't make this harder than it is." Clara stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She turned to look at him fully in the open afternoon light in the middle of the road with the valley spread out around them, and the sound of summer insects in the grass, and the distant cattle, and every ordinary beautiful thing about this particular piece of earth that had somehow, in the course of one improbable summer, become the place where both of them were most themselves. "When I was on the freight wagon," she said, "coming across the territory, I was terrified. I didn't show it because I've never been good at showing it, but I was. I had no idea what I was going to find. The advertisement said capable and serious-minded, and I thought worst case, it's an honest man who needs a capable woman, and that's something I can be. That's enough." She paused. "And then I arrived unconscious, which was not part of my plan." "No," he agreed. "And you made me broth," she said. "And you didn't tell me what to do with myself. And you told me the truth even when it was inconvenient." She looked at him steadily. "And you came through a barn door this morning when I'd told you not to because you knew something I'd refused to fully admit, which is that I did not want to be alone in there." "You weren't alone," he said. "You had the judge's letter and your own nerve, which would have been enough." "Maybe," she said. "But this was better." The road held them in the late heat. "I'm not easy," she said. "I have opinions about things, and I don't drop them when they're inconvenient, and I run numbers on situations instead of running feelings, which people find frustrating. I've been told—" She paused. "I've been told I am not what most men want." "You're exactly what I want," Silas said. He said it simply the way he said most true things, without building up to it, without softening the edges, without making it a performance. Just the plain sentence. Clara looked at him. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, not in the way feelings move in stories, but in the small, real way that genuine things move in genuine lives. Something that had been held at careful distance, letting itself move one step closer. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She turned back to the road and started walking. After 2 steps, she said without looking at him, "You do realize this means you have to stop pretending you weren't watching me from the barn door every morning when I walked the fence line." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I was checking the fence," he said. "You don't own a fence on that side," she said. He looked straight ahead at the road. "No," he said, "I don't." Something that was unmistakably a smile was in her voice when she said, "I thought so." They walked the rest of the way home, side by side in the long gold light of a Montana summer afternoon, with nothing between them that needed to be said, and nothing ahead of them that needed to be feared. And the road under their feet was solid and familiar and entirely completely theirs. The wedding was on a Saturday in early September. Judge Marin, who was passing back through the territory on his return, Circuit performed the ceremony at the ranch with the same businesslike brevity he applied to everything else, which Clara said afterward was exactly what she'd wanted, and Caleb said was the least romantic wedding he'd ever attended, and Jonah said nothing about it all, which for Jonah constituted high praise. The valley came. Not just the families with children in the school, though all of them were there. The Aldermans, the Hendersons, the Greers, with all 4 of their children, including the youngest girl who arrived holding her riverstone in one hand, and a wildflower she'd picked on the road in the other, both of which she pressed into Clara's hand before the ceremony with the absolute seriousness of a 6-year-old making an important offering. The whole valley came, because the valley had watched what happened over the course of one summer, and had drawn its own conclusions, and the conclusions were that a woman had come a long way and built something real, and a man who'd been quiet for too long had remembered what he was doing this for, and those were both things worth showing up for. Mrs. Alderman made a pie which was unnecessary and perfect. Caleb cried, which he denied vigorously and immediately, and which everyone had seen. Jonah did not cry. But after the ceremony, when Clara was talking with the Valley women, and Silas was standing at the fence watching his land in the early September light, Jonah came and stood beside him in the way brothers stand when they don't need to explain why they're there. "You feel different," Jonah said. "Do I?" Silas said. "Less like a stone at the bottom of a river," Jonah said. Silas looked at his brother. Jonah looked at the valley. It was the most personal thing Jonah Walker had said in years. Possibly the most personal thing he had ever said, and he delivered it in the same tone he used to report fence conditions, which was how Jonah loved the people he loved precisely, practically, and without making a production of it. "Yeah," Silas said. "I suppose I do." The school ran through fall and into winter, and by the time the first snow came to Bitter Ridge Valley, there were 11 children enrolled, and Clara had written to the Territorial Education Office in Helena requesting formal recognition and a small stipend for materials citing the judge's prior correspondence as context. The office replied within 3 weeks. The recognition was granted. She told Silas at dinner, "Just set the letter on the table and let him read it." He read it, set it down, looked at her. "Congratulations," he said. "It's not just mine," she said. "The bunkhouse room is yours." "It's yours now," he said. "I think we both know that." She looked at him with that expression, the one he'd been watching since she first opened her eyes in his guest room, and looked at him with those clear gray eyes that never showed everything they contained. The one that was always doing several things at once. The one that he had learned over the course of one improbable and irreversible summer was the expression of a woman who was exactly as serious and exactly as capable as she had ever claimed to be. And also, underneath all of that, quietly, carefully, in the way that real things grow in people who have learned to be cautious with them deeply, permanently glad to be here. "The Henderson boy got his long division," she said. "I heard," Silas said. "He's ready for fractions." "Lord help him," Caleb said from across the table. "Lord help him," Clara agreed. And she was smiling when she said it, the real kind, the one she'd been careful with in the beginning and wasn't careful with anymore. The one that had arrived in stages over the course of a summer and had no intention of leaving. Jonah refilled everyone's coffee without being asked. The fire held the room. Outside, the first snow of the year was starting to find the valley soft and preliminary, covering the fence lines and the south pasture and the creek that ran clear and cold and entirely legally permanently theirs. 3 brothers had spent years building something on this land, something solid and necessary and incomplete, in a way none of them had known how to name, until the freight wagon came up the south road, and a woman arrived unconscious with a letter in her fist and changed everything without trying to. She had not come to save anyone. She had come to save herself. And in doing so, she had walked through a door that a man had fired a shot into the sky to open, not knowing what he was asking for, not knowing what was already on its way to answer him. And she had walked through it and stayed. And the answer had turned out to be exactly this: a table, a fire, a valley, and people who had chosen each other on purpose with clear eyes after everything. That was enough. That was in fact everything.